For decades, Germany has been the backbone of Europe, the heart of the EU, its largest economy, and a manufacturing giant producing 1 in 10 of the world's goods. But this economic miracle, which once seemed unbreakable, is starting to come undone.
Germany's economy is now expected to shrink for the second year in a row.
German companies are struggling to remain competitive.
Volkswagen's historic move to consider factory closures in Germany for the first time in 87-year history.
The country looks likely to enter its third straight year of recession, and more than 3 million people are left without jobs. But instead of watching this decline, Berlin is making a bet. A €500 billion bet. The largest spending package in the country's modern history, worth 15% of its entire GDP. For a nation built on prudence and fiscal discipline, which never spends more than it earns, never borrowing more than it can repay, this marks a radical break. That principle has underpinned Germany's success for decades, shaping its reputation as Europe's economic anchor. But desperate times call for desperate measures. If this gamble works, it could reignite not just the German economy, but Europe as a whole. But if it fails, it won't just destroy the reputation Germany has spent decades building, it could cripple the entire European economy in the process. So how did Germany find itself here? And can this €500 billion gamble really succeed? On the surface, Germany seems similar to other developed economies. It has an educated population, a strong middle class, and wealthy workers. But at its core, it's fundamentally different. Usually when a country's economy grows, they move from selling actual products, things like phones or cars, to services, like finance or legal advice. But Germany is different. They still export huge amounts of manufactured goods, mostly selling to other European countries. Take Wolfsburg in the north of Germany. This city is home to the largest car factory in the world, where more than 60,000 people work, and nearly 1 million vehicles roll off the production line every year. That single factory alone produces more cars than the entire United Kingdom or Italy manages in a whole year. Germany accounts for over a quarter of Europe's manufacturing, and exports make up nearly half of its GDP, 3 times the US's share, and well above that of France or the UK. This means that Germany was constantly bringing in more money through exports than it could spend on imports, and that surplus money flowed back into the country, giving companies huge amounts of money to invest and, crucially, providing the government with extra tax revenue. Thanks to this, the government never needed to borrow huge amounts of money to fuel the economic machine. And while this method of growth was better than many other nations, it wasn't without its own risks. If foreign countries stopped buying German products, the entire model would collapse. The country was effectively reliant on the goodwill of strangers. But rather than trying to mitigate this, the German government decided to double down. In 2009, they passed legislation known as the debt brake, a constitutional amendment that meant governments could at most borrow 0.35% of GDP in a year. For context, the United States regularly borrows at rates more than 5% a year, over 10 times what Germany allows itself to. The idea was that by pledging to keep borrowing low, not only in the present, but well into the future, the German government could bolster investor confidence in the country's economy, driving interest rates down even further. And for a while, this worked. From 2010 to 2019, Germany's GDP grew by almost 25%, outpacing most of Europe. The country's economy looked unbreakable. Unemployment had fallen to under 5%, and they were consistently running trade surpluses of over $200 billion every year, more than any other nation on Earth. By this point, Germany had become synonymous with reliability and precision, from the punctuality of its trains to the engineering of its cars, all reinforcing the sense that the economy was the backbone of the European project. It would take a series of unprecedented economic shocks to throw the German economy off track. But starting in 2020, that's exactly what began to happen. First came COVID. As countries embarked on what would become months of lockdowns, global trade came grinding to a halt. For any country, this would cause some major economic issues. But for Germany, which was uniquely dependent on selling its goods abroad, it was disastrous. Within just a few months, German exports fell by about 10%, wiping out more than €100 billion in trade revenue. The auto industry was hit especially hard, and car production dropped by nearly a quarter in 2020, and sales of German cars abroad fell to levels not seen since the financial crisis. By the end of the year, Germany's economy had shrunk by almost 5%, its worst performance since World War II. But just as the country was starting to recover, a second crisis emerged. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Overnight, exports to Russia worth around €20 billion vanished, and on their own, these losses might have been manageable. After all, Russia only made up about 2% of German exports. But the problem was that Germany relied on Russia for something much more crucial than exports. They needed their oil. Before the war, over 55% of Germany's gas came from Russia, a resource that was vital for powering steel mills, chemical plants, and car factories that drove the economy. But within weeks, Russian gas imports collapsed by 90%. Prices exploded, with electricity costs spiking nearly 35% in just a couple of months. Suddenly, factories across Germany were forced to shut down, not because of a lack of demand, but because they simply couldn't afford to keep the machines running. Slowly but surely, the country's economy fell into recession. By the end of 2024, the GDP of Germany had shrunk by over $200 billion. For context, that's enough to pay for their entire healthcare budget 6 times. Before we look into this more, I want to say thank you to today's sponsor, Fume. This isn't another vape or e-cig, but something completely different. Fume is a flavoured air device built to give you something satisfying to reach for without vapour, nicotine, or any of the usual chemicals. Think of it less like soda and more like a herbal tea. Natural flavours you can actually enjoy. It comes with a premium design made of sleek wood, magnetic fidget features, and no batteries or charging. Just pick it up and go. You can use it anywhere as there's no smoke, no vapour, or no restrictions, and it costs a fraction of what vaping or smoking does. Over 500,000 people have already added Fume into their routine, with flavours like crisp mint, orange vanilla, or cinnamon hearts. If you want to go check it out, go to tryfume.com/invisiblehand or scan the QR code on screen. And for a limited time, use code INVISIBLEHAND to get a free Fume topper when you grab the Journey Pack. Thanks again for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the video. The country has now been in recession for more than 2 straight years, something that's almost unprecedented in the developed world. Normally, when rich countries are facing a recession, governments engage in massive spending sprees to keep the economy afloat. That's exactly what happened during COVID, where countries like America spent a total of over $5 trillion. The premise is simple. By pumping money into the economy, building roads, funding projects, and paying wages, the government puts cash back in people's hands. Then those people spend money with businesses, allowing companies to rehire workers and expand productions, ultimately restarting the economic machine. But Germany couldn't do that. Thanks to the country's strict debt rules, it was stuck in this circle with no real way of escaping. Even as unemployment soared past 3 million people for the first time in decades, the government simply wasn't allowed to borrow. And just when it looked like things couldn't get much worse, America promised to put tariffs of 15% on Germany. Given that this is Germany's 3rd largest trading partner, it would have been a disaster. And models project that this would have knocked an additional 20 billion euros off the country's economy. At the same time, Donald Trump was pressuring Berlin to dramatically increase its defense spending, warning that NATO commitments would no longer be guaranteed unless Germany hit their 5% of GDP target. Given all the other crises the government was facing, reaching this target would have been impossible. So with their backs against the wall, Germany finally did the unthinkable. In March 2025, the government ripped up its most sacred rule, the debt brake, and announced a 500 billion euro spending package, the largest spending spree in the entire history of the country. The money was earmarked for infrastructure upgrades, green energy projects through the Climate and Transformation Fund, and direct support for struggling industries and state-level budgets. For a country that had prided itself for decades on balanced budgets, this wasn't just another policy shift, it was a last-ditch bet that Germany could transform itself fast enough to avoid collapse. And in many ways, this policy makes perfect sense. Models predicted that an injection of this size could lift GDP growth back into positive territory within 2 years, potentially creating over 1 million new jobs and stabilizing tax revenues in the process. The idea was that by spending big in the short term on infrastructure, green energy, and industrial investment, the government could kickstart growth and then use higher revenues to pay down the debt later. Of course, thanks to decades of prudent financial management, the country has enjoyed one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the developed world, and even if it were to add a few billion to its debt, it would hardly make that much of a difference, right? Well, for almost any other economy, this would probably be true, and it might be for Germany, but there is one other factor that makes it a lot more risky than it would be for almost any other country. The entire European economy relies on Germany to be the lender of last resort. Whenever countries like Italy, Spain, or Greece run into financial trouble, Germany tends to operate as their backstop. The problem usually starts when investors begin dumping, say, Italian or Greek bonds, which sends borrowing costs soaring and pushes those countries towards the brink of default. But instead of letting the crisis spiral, in the past, Germany has stepped in behind the scenes, providing funds for these countries' governments to use and restabilize their economy. This is basically the only reason that the economic bloc has been able to survive. Investors are willing to lend to the weaker economies, not because they trust Rome or Athens, but because they assume Berlin will step in if things go wrong. Of course, that system only really works if Germany itself is rock solid. But with this new investment package sizing up to cost around 500 billion euros, the stability could start to come into question. In fact, we're already starting to see reports emerge of foreign investors trimming their German bond holdings, and credit agencies warning of possible downgrades. It's clearly an insanely risky strategy, but the truth is the country doesn't seem to have much of a choice. Projections were estimating that by 2026, unemployment could rise above 5 million people, and GDP would still be stuck in negative growth. By that point, Germany's role as the financial anchor of Europe would have been impossible to maintain. The massive new government investment could, in theory, prevent this. So let's have a look at how this can actually get done. The actual investment package can be broken down into two core components. The first and largest of these is infrastructure, totaling out to be about 300 billion euros. With this money, the government plans to expand high-speed rail networks between major cities, with the idea being that faster and more reliable transport doesn't just save commuters time, but allows businesses to connect their supply chains more efficiently. A car maker in Munich could coordinate production with suppliers in Frankfurt or Hamburg almost seamlessly, massively boosting productivity. And it's worth noting that despite its reputation for efficiency, Germany has historically invested much less in infrastructure than other developed economies. And this has meant that over the years, the cracks have started to show. Currently, over 36% of Germany's bridges on official routes are in urgent need of repair, one of the highest levels in Europe. And as it stands, only 30% of the country has access to broadband coverage, less than half of the EU average. The point is, the country's infrastructure is in a dire state, and the new spending plan could go a huge way to addressing this. Then there's the second part. Roughly 100 billion euros is directly allocated into the Climate and Transformation Fund. This includes plans to build massive offshore wind farms in the North Sea, set to generate 6 terawatt-hours of clean electricity every year, enough to power 1.6 million German households. The government are also spending big on solar, with the goal of increasing its capacity by 5 times before 2030. This is all in an attempt to finally mitigate the effects of the Russian invasion. Despite significant improvements, German electricity prices are still far above what they were at the start of the war. The idea is that if the country can get these back down to normal levels by producing more at home, it would give a much needed boost to the country's manufacturing sector, and with that potentially kick-starting the economy back to growth. The good news for Germany is that programs like this have worked in the past. After World War II, Japan poured nearly a third of its budget into rebuilding roads, ports, and power stations. 2 decades of nearly 9% annual growth that turned a ruined nation into the world's second largest economy. But the truth is that Germany faces a very different reality. Japan was building from scratch, where each new factory or highway delivered massive gains. In a highly developed country like Germany, those gains are far smaller, improving on existing infrastructure rather than building entirely new things. And to make matters worse, the benefit of new projects will take several years, if not decades, to actually come to fruition. According to the country's own central bank, these projects aren't expected to boost economic growth until at least 2027. The trouble with this is that in the meantime, the government will have to pay huge amounts of extra interest on the debt they've taken out to fund these projects. They're already expected to spend around 40 billion euros every year just to service the debt, which is 8% of the entire federal budget, almost the same as what Germany spends on education. If markets aren't confident that investment is going to pay off, the costs will only grow larger. Interest rates increasing by just 2% would cost the country an extra 25 to 30 billion every year. And here's the thing, we're already starting to see this happen. German long-term bond yields have climbed to a 14-year high, now hovering at around 3%. And if they climb much beyond that, it could kill the entire project before it even gets off the ground. In reality, this entire gamble comes down to a question of timing. If the government is able to complete these projects in time, it could boost economic productivity and calm the bond markets, then it could be enough to pull the German economy out of recession. But if the projects go wrong, and if they're caught up in a string of delays and budget increases, then it could be a disaster. What makes this moment so important is that it's much more than just a spending package. It's a complete rethinking of how the German economy operates. For decades, the model was simple. Keep government debt low and let the private sector do the heavy lifting, and rely on exports to drive growth. That system turned Germany into one of the richest countries on earth. but it also left it dangerously exposed to shocks it couldn't control. Now the government is flipping that model on its head. Instead of being the guarantor of financial discipline in Europe, Germany is positioning itself as the driver of state-led investment, betting that hundreds of billions in public spending can rebuild its economy from the ground up. The outcome of this gamble won't just shape Germany, it will serve as a test case for the entire developed world. Can massive state intervention still kickstart growth in advanced economies, or will it prove that the era of government-led miracles is long gone? The truth is, nobody knows. But what happens in Germany over the next decade could set the tone for an economic policy across Europe, and perhaps even beyond. Once again, thank you to Fume for sponsoring this video. Check it out with the first link in the description. Before we end, I just wanted to mention that we've launched a new channel, The Invisible Game, where we uncover the hidden economics shaping your life. Our latest video shows the surprising reason your electricity bill keeps rising: AI data centers. You can watch it here or by clicking the link in the description.